Life can often feel like an endless struggle, filled with moments where it seems as though everything is falling apart. We might experience loneliness, pain, confusion, or even a sense of being abandoned. In those moments, it's easy to feel like we are entirely on our own, that God has turned away, or that He has forgotten about us. However, C.S. Lewis, a man whose life was deeply intertwined with the faith, offers an insight into these challenging times that can help bring us a new perspective. Lewis understood the complexity of human suffering, and he was not unfamiliar with isolation. Throughout his life, he faced deep personal losses, the most profound being the death of his beloved wife, Joy Davidman. This experience of grief brought him to the realization that even in the deepest suffering, God's presence could still be felt, even if in ways we might not immediately understand. In one of his writings, Lewis speaks about the way God uses times of isolation or suffering for a greater purpose. He writes that God often isolates us during difficult periods to help us understand our dependence on Him, to draw us closer to Him, and to prepare us for something greater than we could imagine. These seasons of apparent separation are not always punishments or signs of abandonment. Instead, they are opportunities for transformation, growth, and the deepening of our faith. We might find ourselves questioning why God would allow such hardship. Why would He let us feel so alone? Lewis suggests that these moments can be times of deep spiritual intimacy. He writes, "Pain is God's megaphone to a deaf world, meaning that in our suffering, we might become more attuned to the divine call, more aware of our need for His presence and comfort. It is often in the quiet, isolated moments that we are most likely to hear God's voice, calling us to draw near, to trust, and to lean into Him. There's a common misconception that being a Christian means avoiding suffering, or that God will shield us from all pain. However, the truth is, even Jesus, the Son of God, experienced profound suffering, including moments where He felt abandoned by God. In His most intense moment of isolation on the cross, He cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is one of the most powerful moments in Christian faith, as it shows that even in our deepest moments of despair, God understands our pain. Jesus, through His own suffering, was able to fully identify with us in our moments of loneliness and anguish. C.S. Lewis writes about how God's ways are often mysterious, and it can be difficult to understand His reasons for allowing certain things to happen in our lives. But just because we don't understand doesn't mean that God isn't at work. God often uses periods of isolation to shape our character and to help us develop qualities like patience, humility, and perseverance. During these moments, we can grow in faith, learning to trust God in ways we never would have if everything were easy or comfortable. When we are isolated, we may feel forgotten or insignificant, but in reality, God is doing something powerful in us. He is teaching us to rely not on our own strength, but on His. C.S. Lewis urges us to hold on to the truth that God's love for us is unwavering, even when our circumstances suggest otherwise. Sometimes, the most difficult times can be the ones that lead us to a more profound understanding of God's love and His plans for us. It's also important to remember that isolation doesn't last forever. In Lewis's own life, moments of deep despair were often followed by periods of renewal and growth. Likewise, For those who trust in God, even in the darkest moments, there is always the promise of light. Lewis reminds us that God's timing and ways are not our own. We may not immediately see the purpose of our struggles, but we can trust that God is using those moments to prepare us for something greater. So, if you are feeling isolated or alone, take heart in the words of C.S. Lewis. Know that God is not punishing you, but rather preparing you. He is with you, even in your suffering, and He is using this time to deepen your faith and draw you closer to Him. Do not despair, for isolation is not abandonment. It is a time of transformation, and when the time is right, God will reveal His purpose in your life, and you will come out stronger, more faithful, and more attuned to His voice. Hold on. Trust in His plan, and remember that God isolates us for a reason. Just as gold is refined in the fire, our faith is refined in the furnace of isolation. And when the refining is complete, we will emerge more pure, more radiant, and more prepared for the purposes He has in store for us. As we navigate through times of isolation, it's important to remember that our understanding of these seasons is limited. We live in a world that often values comfort, success, and achievement, where any disruption to our sense of well-being feels like a threat. We naturally try to avoid discomfort, and in doing so, we might miss the opportunity for growth that comes with it. C.S. Lewis understood this tension deeply. He knew that to grow in our faith and character, we often have to face hardship and struggle head-on. He wrote that hardships often prepare ordinary people for an extraordinary destiny, pointing to the fact that God uses the trials and isolated seasons to shape us into something greater than we could have imagined. In moments when we feel disconnected or distanced from God, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking He's no longer present or doesn't care. However, Lewis reminds us that God's silence does not equate to His absence. Just because we cannot feel Him in the moment, it does not mean that He is not at work in our lives. Many times, it is when God is silent that He is doing the most profound work in our hearts. This silence can be a form of training, helping us learn to trust in Him without needing constant reassurance. It's easy to have faith when everything is going well, but true faith is tested when the road is hard and the answers are not immediate. It's also crucial to realize that God's isolation of us during certain seasons is not punitive. There is no condemnation in God's plan for us, even in moments where we might feel overwhelmed or confused. Lewis emphasizes that God's love for us remains unshakable, no matter the circumstances. These periods of isolation or loneliness can seem like abandonment, but they are actually a loving form of correction and refinement. Think of the way a loving parent might distance themselves from their child temporarily in order to help them grow, mature, or learn independence. God's ways are far beyond our understanding. And though we may not always comprehend the reasons behind our pain, we can take comfort in knowing that they have a purpose. In times of isolation, we are also invited to deepen our relationship with God. Just as two people might grow closer when they share a difficult experience together, our bond with God can be strengthened through the trials we face. Lewis speaks of this idea in his book The Problem of Pain, where he discusses how suffering can purify our hearts, causing us to turn to God more fully and deeply. When everything around us feels uncertain, we are called to find our security in Him. It is during these times that we have the chance to embrace the truth that God is enough, even when everything else seems to fall away. Moreover, C.S. Lewis reminds us that we are not alone in our isolation. While it can feel incredibly isolating, the Bible tells us that Christ has been through suffering too. His life was marked by times of rejection, loneliness, and abandonment. In these moments, Christ experienced the full weight of human pain, and He understands what we are going through. He is not distant or indifferent to our struggles. He is not some far-off deity who doesn't care. Rather, He is the God who entered into our suffering through Jesus Christ, walking alongside us in our pain and heartache. In fact, He came to be with us precisely in our moments of deepest need. When Christ was on the cross, He cried out to God in His moment of forsakenness, asking why He had been left alone. His cry reflects the true agony of human suffering. Yet, as He hung there, He also knew that His suffering was part of a greater plan, one that would lead to redemption and healing for all of humanity. Through Jesus, we see that suffering, even when it feels unbearable, is not pointless. It is part of God's larger redemptive story for us and for the world. This is a powerful truth. While isolation can feel unbearable, it is not without purpose. We are not left to suffer without hope. In fact, it is in our darkest moments that God may be working most powerfully within us. It is in the emptiness and silence that God may be preparing us for something far greater than we could have imagined. We may not always understand why we face these trials, but we can trust that God is shaping us into the people He created us to be. Even in the moments when it feels like God has distanced Himself from us, we can still be confident that He is near, working in ways we cannot always see or understand. Our faith in Him, though tested, is being refined. Our trust in His plan is being built. And just as gold is refined in the fire, our faith is refined in the furnace of suffering and isolation. C.S. Lewis also reminds us that when we are isolated, we can take comfort in knowing that we are not forgotten. In fact, this is an invitation to rest in God's presence and trust that His love for us is unchanging. It is during these times that we learn to rely more fully on Him, knowing that He will never leave us or forsake us. The process of isolation might be difficult, but it is ultimately a gift, one that allows us to be conformed more fully to the image of Christ. So, if you find yourself in a season of isolation, loneliness, or pain, take heart. Know that God is at work within you. He has not abandoned you, and He will not leave you there. Trust in His timing, and be open to the transformation He is bringing about in your life. As Lewis says, the pain we feel in this life may not always make sense, but it is a part of the journey that leads to something far greater.